Hello everyone, this is Beth with the Statewide Internet Portal Authority. Thank you all for joining us today. If you haven't seen our instructions, to be able to hear us, you actually have to dial in, so hopefully you're all doing that. Want to introduce Jeremiah Watson from Colorado Interactive today. He's going to do accessibility best practices for the Pacific website platform. We're glad that you've all joined us today. You all are muted. So please utilize the chat box in the left corner so that we can address any questions that you might have. With that, we're ready to get started. So Jeremiah, go ahead.
Thanks, Beth. As Beth said, my name is Jeremiah Watson. I work with Colorado Interactive. We work closely with SIPA to provide the Pacific platform for all eligible government entities to be able to get their content online. So I am kind of the de facto product owner of the Pacific platform, and I work with our Power Users group and our Drupal development teams to try and make things better. So today I'm going to cover a kind of a basic overview of accessibility best practices, as the slide says. And really we're going to dive into three main things, and that really kind of boils down to the first of those would be talking about accessibility compliance overall and kind of why it matters. That's we'll take a quick minute to just go over the, basically cover the basics on that. And then we're going to dive into the best practices, which is most of what we're going to be going through today. And that'll be kind of a walkthrough of a new guide that our team has recently put together to highlight the accessibility content tweaks that you guys can do when you're making content on Pacific. And then we'll close up with a little bit of how to check your work when you're doing accessibility-focused type work in your Pacific site. So first things first, let's start at the beginning. I know that many of you who've called in today may know, quite a bit about accessibility, but maybe there are others who haven't quite dove into it as much. And it can be kind of a daunting thing. So we're going to start at the beginning and talk about the basics, and that is what accessibility compliance kind of means. Really it focuses around standards that have been defined by various groups. So we're going to talk about kind of the two big ones real quick. Compliance standards are essentially a set of rules that have been set forth that everyone has agreed on as the best way to make web content accessible not only to people who are using your site in the standard way by just looking at it through a web browser, but also that it would be accessible to anyone with vision impairments or hearing impairments or other impairments that might need to take special considerations into account when they're looking at your site with a device or a screen reader technology. A screen reader technology is kind of a thing that will, if you're visually impaired, will announce all of the contents of a website to you. And that way you can basically hear it through a set of headphones and interact with the website by hearing what it announces. And a lot of accessibility things kind of focus around those screen reader technologies. They tend to be a set of rules that allow you to make your content really usable if someone is using a screen reader technology, which also ties in a lot of things like with keyboard controls and commands that they might use with their voice for, or specific commands that are specific to screen reader technologies. So that's a lot of what these standards kind of focus on. The first standard is the big one that many of you have probably heard of, and that is the Section 508. Section 508 is a federal standard that was actually an amendment to the United States Workforce Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And it really just kind of mandates that any sort of federal electronic information technology, basically if it's developed or procured or used by the federal government, has to be accessible to persons with disabilities. And that's kind of the big focus of it when you get right down to it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to show you this. This is the section508.gov site, and it kind of is a very detailed deep dive into all of what this standard means, but it's a good place to reference. Again, this is kind of like reading the encyclopedia. There is a lot of information here, and it may be more useful as a reference than as, hey, we're going to sit down and read the whole thing. But again, this is the very important reference for the Section 508 rules. And so again, Section 8 and 508 rules, even though they technically were developed for the federal government and by the federal government, they have been used as a reference for any sites outside of federal government as well. And they've been used as the precedent in some other, in court cases and things like that. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. The other big one that I wanted to talk about is the WCAG standards. And those are kind of the, those are standards that at the WCAG, I'll start with the acronym, sorry. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is what that stands for. And what these were, this is basically a series of accessibility guidelines that were first published by the Web Accessibility Initiative of the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C. And I know that's a lot of names and whatnot, but basically this is kind of looked at as the main de facto international standards organization for the internet at large. And I'm going to go ahead and go over to them as well. There is the main WCAG site. That's at w3.org. And again, that's the W3C guys. You know, these are kind of the guys who police a lot of how the internet should work. And they've got a lot of these standards that they have defined around accessibility. So WCAG is often referred to more anymore than 508 actually. When it comes to private sector sites and internet, you know, again, this doesn't apply just to websites, but it can apply to anything that is an electronic interface like a kiosk or something to that order. So this, again, is a very deep dive. It will, you know, kind of act as a good reference for the many, many standards that have been defined out there. So again, these standards are great because they kind of provide a baseline to make sure that your content can be accessed by technology that you may not be familiar with, or that you may not have anyone in your office or your organization who actually depends on these technologies. You know, the standards offer you a way to kind of say, yes, we're meeting this compliance, we're in the green. People can access this content, and that's great. On the other hand, again, these standards, since they've been defined and out there for a while, they also act as a basis for litigation. And so that's, you know, the thing that's how a lot of these are enforced is by private suits that have actually been making the news more often than not lately when it comes to certain sites that have basically had to suffer fines or remove their content over the fact that it isn't accessible. Some of the bigger ones that are a little more high profile were the the Shields versus Walt Disney case. This is one that happened a few years ago, and it basically boiled down to 3 women with visual impairments sued the Walt Disney Company, and this was because their facilities and their sites were inaccessible to people with vision impairments. This had to do with, again, some of their physical properties on site, and it also had to do with the site's extensive use of Flash. And again, a lot of those pieces of content had to be removed. Now, Flash is kind of old news, so that's good that that's not necessarily a thing you have to worry about anymore. But it's still a good, you know, precedent to remember that even large companies, you know, can be privy to this. The other one was Cullen versus Netflix. That one was another high-profile suit where Netflix launched a product called Netflix University. And this is one where hearing-impaired customers filed suit in a federal court, alleging that Netflix had failed to provide captioning. And, you know, captioning kind of falls under a larger umbrella of providing that alternative text that, with any sort of media, that is extremely important to anyone using a screen reader. And again, this resulted in a lot of content having to be taken down. So, okay, rewind now. I know that this is kind of daunting because it sounds like there are huge rule books out there, and that they are very scary because you can be litigated against if you don't follow them. And it is a complex area. There are people who have, you know, there are firms, there are people out there that have, you know, dedicated a large part of their career to making sure that websites and products are accessible. It is a significant piece of the pie when it comes to web design. But there is good news. Even though this is a big complex thing, the good news here is that Pacific structure is accessible. We've done a lot of work to make sure that kind of the basics when it comes to how regions are defined and how input forms on the site structure, like the search window and that sort of thing, are implemented. We've implemented them in a way that takes care of a lot of the the minor rules and things like that would apply to them. And we've done a lot of releases in order to keep up with the changing guidelines. Section 508 actually just recently got a refresh in the year 2017, and we're going to be releasing a few items shortly to make sure that we're as accessible as possible when it comes to the structure of the site. So in good news, that using a platform like Pacific will help you along with a lot of that stuff that is not necessarily in the hands of content creators. And on the flip side of that, most of these high-profile litigation suits that are out there, there's been a little bit of study that has gone into them, and they've shown that most of them tend to focus on basic content accessibility. They focus on the really simple stuff, actually. There are many rules. They're all very important, and those are things to take into account whenever you're building any kind of a custom application or something like that. But most of the stuff that makes the news, quote unquote, really kind of tends to focus on the stuff that's simple to input. When you're creating content, there are a few simple things you can do that cover honestly most of the issues out there, and we're going to go over that today. This is not meant to be a definitive, de facto. Everything is going to be covered in the full realm of accessibility in the next few minutes, but we will talk about the big items that you can implement when you're making content, and that will get you, that will make sure that your content is pretty darn accessible, and that's what we're shooting for. So, one other quick note before we dive into the how-to here is that I'm going to talk about not only how, compliance is very important, and you have to make sure that compliance is observed, of course, but one other thing that has been brought up a lot lately is usability. And that's actually something that we're going to talk about a little bit too, that it's one thing to make the letter of the law and ensure that you're compliant. It's another thing to do things in a way that is convenient and put yourself in the shoes of someone who may be trying to access your content. And even though you may have put some text associated with an item, maybe that text isn't really helpful. And that's, again, the kind of the thing where not only do you need to put yourself in the mindset of, hey, I want to make sure my content is compliant, but the end goal of compliance is to make sure that it's usable as well. And we'll show you basically what I mean. It's really just kind of boils down to making sure that you don't just follow the letter of the law, but you also follow the spirit of it as well. So without further ado, I think we're going to go ahead and dive into the best practices how-tos here. And for that, I am going to go and actually reference a guide that we have recently put out. This guide is going to be on the self-study training curriculum page of our Going Pacific site. If you have not seen that site before, it is at www.colorado.gov/Going Pacific. And you go to the training curriculum how-to guides page, and you will get right here. Looks like this, self-study training curriculum, and you go down to how-to guides, and it's right at the top. It's our new 508 compliance best practice guide. And that gets you this document right here, which I'm going to dive into for kind of the walkthrough here. So this, again, is not meant as an end-all be-all, but it is meant as a way to show you the most common things that most websites suffer and ways to implement fixes for them in Pacific when you're making content. And it's important to note that anything in this guide can be followed when you're making new content, and it can also be applied to existing content pretty easily, which is good news. So the first thing we're going to cover, and if you don't remember anything else from this webinar, it's this, and it's probably the most important. I already mentioned the concept of alternative text. Alternative text is the most important and one of the most important and one of the most often overlooked elements of accessibility. What this does is it assigns text to an image, iframe, or any sort of media that will basically announce it to a screen reader. And again, this is the part that a lot of people overlook when they're adding images. And it make trying to use a website when you're using a screen reader or some such like that much more difficult, especially if your image is very if there are many images and you're confused when you're hearing them announced. So this is really the biggest best practice we can focus on. And we're going to walk through the simple ways to do it in a few different ways on Pacific. So, like I said, this is alternative text is defined as any word or phrase that is inserted as an attribute in an HTML document that will tell website viewers the nature or contents of that image. So, the easiest, let's start with a couple of examples I have here. The guide, if you're following along at home, will walk you through how to add an image in the WYSIWYG. If you already have a Pacific site, you're probably pretty familiar with the basics of adding an image, but you go through and you upload it. There's a separate guide on specifically how to use the WYSIWYG editor if you're not familiar with that. But the whole point is once your image is uploaded into Pacific, you're going to go ahead and right-click the image properties. And again, this can be done on existing pages as well. And once you're in those image properties, you've got a field specifically for alternative text. So again, this is good that you don't have to get into the HTML to add alternative text in Pacific. You've got a tool right there that will kind of show you, hey, you need alternative text here. And if you put it there and you hit OK and you save or publish, you're gold on that particular image. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at this. I'm on our Learn to Surf site, and I've logged in. Here's one of our test users. I've got a couple examples. Here's an image example that is good to go, and it's just a basic text with some image that I've added in the WYSIWYG. And again, right now you can't really see that there's any sort of alt text involved in just a regular web browser. But if I edit it, you can look here, and if I right-click, go into the image properties, you can see right here I've got alternative text to the tune of describing that it has 9 dots. Now, this is where we get to that whole following the letter of the law and following the spirit of the law thing. Alternative text is always important, and you want to try and be not too verbose, but also not too plain. For instance, putting an alternative text that says picture is probably not going to be helpful. But putting an alternative picture, alternative text that says this is a picture of 9 dots might be a little too verbose. Again, you have to put yourself in the shoes of someone who is hearing this. The reason I went with just describing this as 9 dots is because describing the color may not be helpful. That's extra information, and describing its function or its link is something that a screen reader typically is going to do. But there is a scenario where you may want to be more detailed than this, and that's one that I want to bring up is, for instance, a lot of times people will use graphics as buttons on Pacific. And in that case, you would probably want to describe, button. This is a button. That button goes to wherever you want, and that might be a really good descriptive alternative text for that particular image if it's something that is functional. Again, that's going to be super, super helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel on this because it's already ready to go. And we'll look at this other example that I made where we had another kind of abstract image here. And this one is bad because I'm going to go into it and see that even though I've already uploaded my image and placed it and all that jazz, I have not, however, added any alternative text. It's blank. So that's a bummer. I am going to go ahead and put this one as triangles picture, which is somewhat of a good alternative text. It's a picture of triangles. Again, if this was a button or if this was a picture of someone doing a particular action, you would probably want to be more descriptive, of course, but this one is just sort of an extra that's added. So again, it's just good to always have it. So again, that is really as simple as it gets. It's not a huge task, but it's one that just kind of gets overlooked most of the time. And if you add alternative text to your pictures, you will be doing a world of good. Now, that covers how to add alternative text to something in the WYSIWYG, but there's also another element to this, and that is that you would want to add it to other things that you might put in the WYSIWYG, such as iframes. A lot of folks use iframes. Oh, actually, well, okay. I'm going to go in order of the guide, actually. My order got a little off there, so sorry about that. Got ahead of myself. The guide actually now goes over the specific content types that have been added to Pacific, and they are just as important as adding pictures in the WYSIWYG. So we'll go ahead and walk through that as well. The good news is, again, you don't have to get into HTML code. This is one of those areas where Pacific structure provides a way to make this pretty easy. And this guide will walk you through how to edit your existing content. If you go to the edit screen for your content, when it comes to slider images, footer logos, banners, all of these things are graphics, of course. They also need alternative text. And again, this is very important for people who are using your site, especially things like banners and footer logos, because those are announced every single time someone will load a page. So it's super important. The standard instructions of how to upload your image, and then you will of course go through the crop animation. This is again just kind of basic content stuff. But as soon as that image has been uploaded into one of those content types, you'll see there is an alternative text field. And this is the one that always needs to get filled out. And again, the process is largely the same. It's just, again, these content types are kind of the things that are outside the WYSIWYG. So we'll go ahead and walk through that real quick. I'm going to go to the content of the current site, and we're going to look at this Learn to Surf banner. There it is. That was created quite a while back, but edited recently. And you can see right here that there's the existing banner, and I don't have to do anything to change it necessarily if I don't want to, but I do need to add this alternative text. And I put up here that this is a banner, and it's got a label of Learn to Surf on it. So again, descriptive of kind of what it is and what's going on in it. That's all it needs, is really just a simple addition to any of those content types. And I'm going to go ahead and click Save, even though I didn't change anything. The other thing that is important to do is your footer logos. I have a test one on this site. And, oops, that was my bad. I meant to go home. There we go. I have a test image down here in the Brand Colorado footer area. So let's go ahead and check that one out real quick. I'm going to do the same thing. I'll just go to my current site content, and there's a test footer logo. That's our Brand Colorado footer logo guy there. Let's go ahead and edit him. And this one's blank. So that is a bummer. I think we're going to go ahead and call that footer, or actually you could call it image. You could call it, you can call it whatever you think is the most descriptive. But in fact, that one I typed in earlier might actually make a lot more sense. Image, footer logo. And I don't really have anything in this footer logo. Maybe you would put your brand image there and you would say, that's what it is, Colorado branding. But this one's pretty simple because it's just a test. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And that's really all there is. Again, it's pretty simple stuff, but it is super important. And that if anything else, if you remember anything else from this training, that is honestly the gist of most of what you want to do when it comes to accessibility, implementation and content. So I did mention another thing that I kind of got ahead of myself with, and that is iframes. Iframes are also important to add descriptive text to. It uses a little bit of a different nomenclature when it comes to iframes, but it's also important. They have what's called a title and a description, and some screen reader technology is going to look for this when it is announcing iframes to people in content. So we're going to go over to this other example I have here. I've iframed in a YouTube video. And again, there are other trainings that kind of go into how to do that. You can iframe in multiple things, Facebook feeds, Twitter feeds, all that stuff. And it all follows kind of the same procedure. I go ahead and I'm going to edit this content. It's very similar to what you do with images. I've already pasted my iframe in. You can do that multiple different ways. If you open up the source code and paste in your iframe, embed, what have you, there are guides that focus specifically on this. But once it's in there, and I'm looking at it in the WYSIWYG, I'm going to right-click it. I'm going to go into the properties. And here, I've got a name and advisory title. This is the important thing to fill out. Again, this is not quite as, this doesn't come up in scans as often as the alternative text thing, but it is another one of those things you want to do just to be as helpful as possible. And your name and advisory title can be the same. In fact, it might be best if they were the same. But I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing here. This is a video training WYSIWYG. So short and sweet. It's there, and that will let people know what is going on in this video. Okay, cool. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And there it is. And that, again, very simple. It's something that you always want to take into account. And oh, that wasn't actually the training on the WYSIWYG. Oof, my mistake. I would want to go back and fix that. This is using administrative menus. My bad. A quick note on iframes as well, in general. Iframes are, of course, something that is being pulled from another website, and sometimes content from the other website may actually be inaccessible itself. So even if you put a name and advisory title on them, if the content you're pulling from another site is inaccessible, and has issues, then it's still obviously going to render as with inaccessible issues on your site as well, even if you put a name and advisory title. So it's always important to kind of keep that in mind. One thing that kind of tends to flummox iframes a lot is when they have input fields. Input fields are kind of dicey in the sense that they don't always announce themselves correctly to screen readers. And again, that's something you may or may not have control over. If you have an input field from another website or web form or something that you're pulling into a site with an iframe, it's always good to double check and make sure that it is accessible. And we'll show you some ways to do that. Just because again, you don't want to be iframing something on your site that maybe is inaccessible itself, because then you're providing something that's inaccessible by proxy. One other quick thing to go into here is colors. And this guide actually has a really great section talking about how to use color. This is our iframe stuff. Just goes into how to add that name and advisory title. Very good. Color contrast is another one that makes a lot of, it can cause problems not just for folks who have screen readers obviously, but for people who may have vision impairments or are red-green colorblind. Color contrast is very important to keep in mind. And so we basically, again, this is a really helpful guide that kind of goes into whether or not the content is easily readable. Is there enough color contrast between the background and the text? When color is used to convey any sort of meaning, do text, icons, or symbols provide, that they convey the same meaning? This is a really good example actually, and I'm so glad that our team put together in this. Is maybe you have text that describes something like press the start button as opposed to press the green button, because what if your users can't see green? That's the kind of thing to think about. That again, this is not necessarily letter of the law compliance, but this is very big for usability. So this is a good little section to just kind of put your head in your users' thought patterns if you can, as much as possible when you're making your content. Then we also have a really good kind of section that shows, hey, here are some HTML colors and what the background and foreground would look like that is very acceptable and very nice. This is high contrast. This is great. And then we've got some color schemes that are not great. Particularly this one at the bottom with a background of red and a foreground of yellow. This is completely invisible text to some users. So this is the kind of thing you really want to avoid when you're choosing those background colors. And we have a little caveat here. In Pacific, we pretty much advise you not to adjust background content color on your mini site to avoid any kind of these weird issues. if possible, we really encourage you to use that default, even though you can customize the colors in other areas as well. So this is again kind of the one that the guide really does actually cover it quite well. But the site that I've shown you here does have one little example of color contrast, and this is pretty straightforward that I've highlighted this with a dark gray and I've left this one alone. That's the kind of thing you want to watch out for. Again, it can be tempting to use a lot of different colors, and in some cases that will work fine. But it really, with an eye to accessibility, there's things you want to avoid when it comes to color contrast, and it is usually your best bet to play it safe and leave it at the defaults. So okay, that's our quick note on color contrast. Again, that's another one that is important. And there are ways to check your work as well. So that's our actually next section. Oh, I did want to mention this at the end of this document. We have the links to the Section 508 and things like that that will show you, that site that we looked at earlier that kind of goes into all the rules and in depth. So, okay, so that kind of is the walkthrough. I do want to show you a quick cool thing about how to check your work as well, because as you saw, we didn't really have any visual indicators as to what we were doing was having any effect, because we're not using screen reader technology and such. So there are multiple ways to do this actually, and the big one is using a compliance checking tool. Some of you may be familiar with some of these and some of you may not. So the first option, of course, is paid options. Site Improve is a tool that has been used by some of our agencies, and it's extremely effective. And it is also a little pricey, and so that may not be the option that you would like to go with. But it is a very comprehensive tool, and it's in many ways one of the best ones out there. This is actually the website for Site Improve. You'll notice their URL is even accessibility.siteimprove.com. So they have a very comprehensive package that scans your site that will bring you any sort of issues that will go into very much a deep dive on these these standards, and it's a very good tool. If you're not looking for a paid tool, however, there are other options, and the big one is the Wave tool. That one is wave.webaim.org. That is a free tool that's provided by the W3C, and it's extremely competent actually. It doesn't do a lot of automated checking and things like that, but you can plug any page you're creating into it and get a quick little check that is actually very useful. So I'm going to show you that real quick. Where did I put that Wave tool? I think it's in here. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so the Wave tool basically consists of plugging in a URL. In fact, I can show you that from the beginning if you want. I'll go ahead and just go back to the beginning here. Oh, I didn't do it. My bad. So, okay. So when you first go to Wave, you get this interface here, and it says, okay, that's great. Give me the web page address. So I'm going to go ahead and look at one of our images examples here. Grab that URL. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to paste it over here into this web page on Wave. Give it a look-see, and it will look at that page and kind of give you a little report. Now obviously it's messing up the formatting to show me all these things because that's what it should do. But it's kind of giving you a quick little look into what a screen reader would think of your page. And this is pretty cool because it shows your alt text. And if you don't have alt text, it will kind of light you up and say, hey, this is bad. There's an error here. You'll see this page has 0 errors, but it does have a couple of alerts. And the alerts, they can be helpful, and sometimes they're not helpful. Again, Wave is going to kind of look at everything completely as if it were down to the letter of every standard. And again, these are not errors. They're just a, hey, you may want to change this, but sometimes maybe not. Things like an unlabeled form element with a title. That's actually up here. You can see the little yellow tag, and it's referring to this search window. We have an ARIA label for it, on the site search, but we don't necessarily have a title for it because that would actually be redundant. It's also saying, hey, there's some very small text that is involved in one of the areas on this site. And I believe it might be referring to one of these social share buttons. Oh no, it's actually referring to the footer, and it might be referring to some of the text around here. I'm actually not entirely sure what that one's referring to. So again, what Wave provides you is very good information, but you're mostly kind of looking for the red errors. Red errors are going to be the big ones that show you, hey, you have a real problem here. And again, the big one it's going to come back with is, hey, you have no alternative text. What's going on here? But it's a really good little tool to kind of get a gut check on real quick. And that's how it works. It's really that simple. You plug it in, you see your changes, and then you go from there. One quick note to work if you're if many of you are going and plugging your pages into Wave right away and making changes and adding alt text. Adding alt text may actually take a little bit to show up if you're adding it to an existing resource. Pacific will sometimes publish that instantaneously. Pacific may take a couple of minutes. So if you're immediately changing your alt text on your existing images or banners and you're not seeing it show up in Wave right away, give it a couple of minutes, you'll see it show up soon. And for instance, this footer actually has the one I entered, but I only entered that a couple of minutes ago. But if I had done that immediately, it may not have shown up, right away. So that is kind of the end-all, well, again, not the end-all be-all, but that is what we've walked through today as far as showing, the basics of kind of around compliance, and then showing some things you can do in Pacific, and showing ways to check your work. So I hope you found this helpful. This is, again, not meant to be kind of an all-comprehensive guide, but it is something that should help you through, some of the most prevalent issues that we've seen on websites in general. So with that, I was going to hand it over to Gabby and Beth and ask if anyone has questions. We'll see what we can do.
Sure. Thanks, Jeremiah. That was really great. So we do have a couple of questions. Can you see them in the participant feedback box if you want to address those? Otherwise, I can read them to you.
I don't think I can, unfortunately.
Okay. The first one is from Rachel. Is there a specific format for alt text? I've heard you should put dashes, not spaces, between words.
That is a good practice. It's not entirely necessary. Spaces are actually okay. And the only formatting thing that I would kind of mention around alt text, and I can show you that here again. Let's go back to our Wave tool. You can see here that we've got a dash in between banner and learn to surf, but we've got spaces and learn to surf. And Wave doesn't necessarily have a problem with it. And a lot of our accessibility tools don't really come back and say, hey, there's a space here that's bad. We haven't really heard. I know that is a rule that's been said kind of from back in the old HTML days of, hey, don't put don't put spaces in your stuff. Put underscores, put dashes. But it's not a strict rule. Again, I think the most important thing is to make it so that the text is helpful, and especially in the era, when it comes to buttons and things like that, to describe what it does.
Great. And then Rachel had another question that I'll get to you offline, Jeremiah. We did, and that looks like that is all we have. So I want to thank everyone for their participation today. We will provide this recording a little bit later this week or early next week so that you have it as a reference. Jeremiah, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, that was great. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to everybody about this, and I hope you found it helpful.
Great. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.